leading up to this were like, okay, there was fraudulent money issue with, a retail vendor to the tune of, I'm just going to throw a number out there so it's not easily identified, but like a big sum of money, 15 to 25,000, like a huge sum of money. How is this all connected? And how did the bad guy get all of these things? Their MSP, he diverted the stuff coming in, which I think really helped out in the total destruction that could have happened.
This is the Cybercrime Lab, a podcast about true cybercrime stories, the impact on victims, and what businesses can do to protect themselves and their customers. And if you think you're not at risk, that is exactly where attackers want you to be.
In my experience, it only takes hearing what these attacks are like a few times to realize you need to prepare yourself for what could be a business-ending experience.
That's Andy Anderson, the founder and CEO of DataStream Insurance. For over a decade, Andy has been working with victims of cybercrime. He's seen firsthand the human impact of a cyber attack. Now, he's on a mission to shed light on the threats we all face from a world we can't see. Today, Andy has invited Violet Sullivan to the Cybercrime Lab. Violet is a data privacy and security attorney. She's the vice president of client engagement at Redpoint Security, a cyber forensics company, and has worked on cyber incident response teams as well as in risk management insurance. Violet has helped many victims who have experienced cyber attacks, from business email compromises that turned into so much more, to network breaches. She has learned and seen a lot and has a passion for the more technical side of these attacks. On this episode of the Cybercrime Lab, Violet and Andy will get into the nitty-gritty of these attacks, and they both share their thoughts on how the international community could do much more to stop them.
We were so excited to have you come on the Cybercrime Lab podcast. And we've got all kinds of stuff to talk about today. And so I've got to ask, how did you were a lawyer. How did you get sort of lost in this world of cybersecurity and cyber incidents?
I feel like everyone years ago, no one does cyber intentionally. Everyone has their how I fell into cyber story. And I started working on the operational side before I knew I didn't know what a data breach was 9 years ago. I'd never heard the word. Target just happened. Consumers didn't even understand it. And I lucked into working for a company that handled some of the biggest breaches at the time, which I started with SuperValue, Albertsons, Home Depot, Sony, Anthem, all of these big ones, 800 other people. So everyone uses those credibility pieces for the start of their career, but it launched a whole bunch of people besides me. So it was being in the right place at the right time, working and seeing how, and I feel like I was lucky enough to say, okay, it's not just the legal side that handles it. It's not just the technical. I actually got to start on working on how the heck do you print out 78 million pieces of paper? Like operational mail vendors, credit monitoring, ID repair, call centers. I started realizing there's such a bigger world out here to these incidents. And that's when I kind of dug in and said, what part of this do I want to really chase after? And for me, the thing that made a lawyer more unique was understanding the technical and being able to translate the technical. There weren't many of those out there. And that's something I've been working towards with certifications or just education learning. I've been leaning towards how to be more technical.
Well, I think we're going to dive into at least one of the cases that you worked on, a business email compromise case. And then we'll maybe dive off of that into other things, but let's start with that case and sort of, where did it start? Take us to that sort of that day and for yourself and the potential victim.
So I think the best place to start, because I'm in the cyber insurance world, is to think about everyone has their first call, right? Whether it's to cyber insurance, whether it's to their MSP, every business, when screens go dark or when they feel like they've lost out on money, they have a call. It may go to the bank first, it may go to law enforcement. They have to decide that is every case-by-case basis in their relationships. But in my world, it usually happens with cyber insurance called first. Then there's an army of people that kind of come on to look at it from different angles. You have the breach counsel or outside legal counsel. You have sometimes the technical expert that might be called after or at the same time. But this scoping call that usually happens may happen at different levels. So the people in the business, they might have a scoping call, but just have their MSP on the phone. They might have already hashed it out 7 times before it gets to insurance. Doesn't matter. But as it comes out, what happened with this incident that kind of breaking down BC is, and I said business email compromise, but I feel like we use too many acronyms in our world. So I have to say it again, is that you have someone that is terrified they did something wrong. They personally, sometimes it's usually personally the person whose account was compromised. I don't usually hear often, oh, we throw someone under the bus because they did it. It's usually like that person's on the call trying to lead you into, I don't know what I clicked on. I don't know what went wrong. Everything's gone.
Yeah. And just to set the stage, like what kind of, I mean, again, you don't need to, you know, give all the identifying details, but was this a big company? Was this a small company? Right.
Oh, actually, I know, like, let's say 15 to 20 employees. So,
okay. So yeah, like a doctor's office, right? We're not talking major corp.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Like 1 or 2 physical locations, like, small, you know.
And essentially like I mean, in that size, maybe they don't even have an IT person. It's like the office manager, or some admin person at or the, you know, a doctor, somebody who's,
yeah, it's either someone's nephew or a third party MSP, usually not like a full-time employee.
Okay. So they call, they're talking to you, and there must be this weird dynamic because there's this, I think anytime you know, and I think it's why people are so sort of confused and afraid of insurance, right? Because they're like, am I going to say something that's going to be basically say that this was my fault and now we're not going to cover you, right? It's sort of like there's that worry that they did something that either is going to get them fired or they're not going to get coverage for, right?
Yeah, and that actually leads into the question of when all the clues, so we'll like lay out the clues is like the crime, you know, podcast of where was the evidence, when they all lead to, there was someone the other day that said, you know, in the medical, we hear in house or the medical profession, when you hear hooves, don't think zebras, think horses. Like what's the most logical course of action is usually the more, you know, the more common way. So that when you see all these clues and they attribute to, well, it doesn't make sense that the threat actor would go to this much effort. I think you have to think that, remind yourselves that the criminals are human, because the level of effort, they usually still cut corners like everyone else in their job, right? Like they're not going to go and get you to do 2-factor on every single thing if somehow they have single sign-on where they can bypass 2-factor, or if they have some way to get around it. So the clues leading up to this were like, okay, there was fraudulent money issue with, you know, a retail vendor to the tune of, you know, I'm just going to throw a number out there so it's not easily identified, but like a big sum of money, 15 to 25,000, like a huge sum of money to a retailer.
So like an online somebody's ordering stuff using
and what was interesting is the person talking through it, the person whose account was impacted, assumed that this person was sophisticated, not because of what they saw or did, but for some reason, the locations of where these packages were sent were all over the country. So that made them think they've done this before. Whereas I could go and send, like, I could go to Amazon and send places like 6 different places without names. Like I would know how to do that. And I'm pretty, like, I wouldn't be I'd be an amateur.
Yeah, but you're like, in order for them to like, why are they doing this? They must, I mean, although it does imply at least a certain amount of, well, maybe they're just doing Christmas shopping, right? Like they have family members.
You know, $15,000, $20,000 worth of like, how do you, I don't know exactly what was ordered. Like I don't have a list of like what the order form is. And actually our team right now, so ongoing case is actually looking to see the Amazon log situation. Like how can you actually look through the Amazon logs to prove anything beyond what you see in the order, like as a individual order list?
Yeah, and I remember, so like years ago, a friend got their like their check stolen, right? And like literally, like, you know, it's checks. So they started writing checks on this this account, right? And like one of the things they did was like write a check to like a utility company for, like electric or phone service. And I remember I remember talking to the cops and being like, there's no Perry Mason here, buddy. Like, who do they, like, I think that you could go, like, who did they pay the electric bill for? Okay. So anyway, so you've started to see kind of all of this stuff going on, right? And so you're trying to figure out how, and again, it is like pulling on a thread, right? You don't know how they did it.
How is this all connected, and how did the bad guy get all of these things? All right. It's not just, the link just doesn't magically open up 6 different authentication options.
Right.
The other thing is she never said, the account owner never said that it was, she never said that she gave over her login. Like, she never said that there was a box and she entered in her password. Okay. So that also was like, okay, well then how did it get, like, that's the solve is, so how did they get the different passwords to different things in different areas, and then work through things that might have had 2-factor? And that's when our forensics, like our lead right at that point, said, were you using like a password keeper, or were you using some kind of like way to store all your password? And they said, oh yes, LastPass. And I apparently, and I'm not sure when the incident was, but LastPass was exposed at some point in the last 4 months. I don't remember when it was, 6 months maybe. I don't know what the date was, but LastPass has been exposed. And I started, later conversations with that same forensics, I was going, well, how would it get past 2-factor? And they said LastPass actually, because he's worked with them on the single, I don't want to throw them under the bus, but he said a lot of forensics providers actually use LastPass a lot when they contract to each other, so that they can share it without having to Teams message or password, or like, do it in a very unsecure way. But it's now with this case, we're seeing it used that there's actually single sign-on option for LastPass, meaning LastPass can override 2-factor because they're pulling all the passwords in one. And so if you have the passwords in LastPass and somehow they got those passwords, then if they come in through LastPass instead of coming in through the bank or the retailer, then you can get into all. So this is why we were like, okay, this has to be it. But we'll see how this goes, because this is still evolving and working. But they were almost adamant that it couldn't be LastPass. But that's the question, and there's where the crime is confusing, is it could have happened another way, right? It could have happened without LastPass being the central source of all of the keys to get into this and perpetrate the crime and cause the fraud in the retailer and the bank, and even the attempted fraud, because there was a lot of attempted fraud around what happened. And we don't know still, until we do forensics, if someone has more access still for global admin, if they got that.
While password storage services like LastPass are convenient, especially in distributed companies or organizations that often use contractors, it's important to be aware of the risks that come along with using them. We often talk about the importance of multi-factor authentication, and Violet's story is just one example as to why. However, you'll notice her clients were very adamant that it wasn't because of LastPass, and they end up being right. You'll learn more about that soon. For now, let's come back to Violet, who shares why Office 365 was such a crucial piece to solve this puzzle.
They're starting to talk to you about like, okay, this stuff is going on. It's clear that it's been a, some sort of crime, right? And so first they're seeing all this like fraudulent activity on the, Amazon or similar online merchant, right? What else would sort of tip them off?
Bank account. So that's when I think they mentioned the retail exploit first, and then they mentioned the bank account where they tried or attempted, and then they mentioned also like a retirement account for the entire company, like for that healthcare group, that they had received in the middle of the night. So this transpired over 3 to 5 days, and they received requests for MFA that they rightly ignored, but they were worried that it was all happening when the stuff they didn't know was going on was also happening. So they were trying to get into multiple things, right? A bank account, a retail online ability to pay, a retirement account, and then also there was kind of questions on whether they have inside the network, and that's why we're working on it, because we're looking beyond the BEC, because there's like that level of, okay, you do an analysis of Office 365, the email, the Teams, the everything, which, by the way, if you haven't logged into the web version, I've had a couple of attorneys that I walked through the web version because they've only seen what's on their desktop, like the application. And when you look at the web version, you're like, oh my God, they would have access. If you got into my 365 global account, they can get Teams, they can get OneDrive, they can get files. Like it's beyond email, right? And even though we say business email compromise, I think it's important to say, when you log in the O365, like go look at it, and that's everything they would touch, right? OneNote, like passwords that you keep everywhere, whatever. That's a bigger piece. So when they started talking about wondering if there's network, there's the O365 review that we would do, but there's also a forensic where we have to see if other email accounts beyond this one that was looked at of the 15 employees, like, are there pings where they already showed that they not only, and I left this part out, but they not only took control over that account, but they overrode it and made it so that they couldn't have that privilege again, and they created a new privilege. So basically made a super user and then kicked the other user out of the network, so they don't have access to anything to like update. So they couldn't even update. So they did a really creative thing, actually. They ended up taking their email address and saying any emails that go to this account were rerouted to the person's personal, because they couldn't even get into the email, the original email, to like stop anything, like even two-factor or whatever. So they just rerouted it, which I think usually you hear these horror stories on their MSP messed it up. This person who helped them, like, she was giving all the credit in the world to them, because at least he diverted the stuff coming in, which I think really helped out in the total destruction that could have happened.
The victim's MSP was the real hero in today's story. As Violet aptly mentions, he came up with a creative way to outsmart the threat actor in the hopes of saving the business. In these types of cases, victory can sometimes come down to the victim's ability to outthink the threat actor. At the end of the day, these criminals are human beings that can be taken down and brought to justice if you have the right team behind you. Now let's dig a little deeper into how Violet approaches cyber crimes.
I mean, there's so many unknowns. And I think that's another thing about cybercrime is, if you expect it to be tied in a bow, like just like a crime, like you're going to have I don't knows, and you're going to have fog of war in everything you investigate. It's never going to be clear, especially from the very beginning scoping call. So you try to put things in order as best you can. And one of the things that I respect when a technical team will actually go through the hypotheticals and cross them off and basically say, well, is someone in your network? Okay, we're looking at network traffic. And then we cross that out. Okay, is someone authenticated? Is someone taking access? And they go and reset all the passwords. So there's different methods of containment for every possible pathway. To me, that's the best type of technical response, is to actually take every hypothetical and not rule anything out. And my favorite is when people actually think about, what if we just screenshotted this? Or what if it was a Post-it note? What if you have to be a little bit more beyond the technical tools and saying, okay, it's going to be a technical breadcrumb. Like, you're not going to have a perfect technical breadcrumb. So you have to think more criminal and more like common sense, even dumb criminal, to say you can't rule out the dumb ways that people can do this, or you can't rule out the lying on either side, the good guy or the bad guy.
Yeah, there's an amazing Silicon Valley episode where they the CTO leaves like a sticky note with a password on his desk, and then the guys just like walk by and just took a picture of it and then use it. And the guy's like freaking out because he's like, I built this perfect system, right? So
you could do a whole podcast on Silicon Valley and breaking down how realistic it is.
A really interesting case, right? And again, like, I think another highlight of how, in some ways, there's all kinds of easy ways to do this, right? And depending on how motivated an attacker is, they can get in and find a way, right? And unfortunately, and maybe you have perspective here, like talking with, I don't know, those of us who don't encounter, at least aren't dealing with criminals on a daily basis. Like, I think you imagine that they're like, different people, or they're like, they're they're so different than
like
right.
sophisticated.
I think, I don't know, you're from your experience, like, my sense is they're more normal than we would maybe want to admit,
Yeah.
right?
Well, you saw the Conti web leaks, right? In the spring, right after the Ukraine and Russia war, there was this like defect hacker that leaked all of these chat logs, and it was like so much data. Like anyone that says they've read them, like I only believe Brian Krebs that has actually read them in full detail. I had some lawyers that would say, like Stupinesky, we were joking about how much detail was in that. I'm like, but you didn't read all of it. There's no way, because I couldn't get through like 2 pages. That shows you how human this is. And that shows you how they were asking for raises and days off and time with their kids. And like there's a human element to the crime that is inescapable. And I think we're foolish if we think it's like sci-fi. Just look at like, I mean, look at the people like what they at DEF CON, at the hacker conference. They actually have a phone booth set up where they try to call people to social engineer to see if they'll fall for it. And they'll call a company's HR and be like, we're your IT, we need to log in your computer. I'm like, oh, sure, here we go. Like, it's even the good guys know how the bad guys think. And if you're not skeptical, and that's why so much training is about being skeptical, it's just like going to a foreign country and wearing a fanny pack and holding your passport in your fanny pack and safely. Like, you just have to realize that I don't mean to be, I'm a super optimistic person, but you have to be pessimistic about crime evolving in cyber world. It's so easy.
Which I think brings us to a graphic that that we've been working on together, actually, and we'll share with folks, which is where you were comparing a little bit the difference between like what the cyber crime world and particularly the ransomware ecosystem looks like now versus like the height maybe of the cocaine drug trade in the late 80s, early 90s, and walk people through kind of that, why maybe you came up with that analogy, and we'll share the graphic in the show notes, etc. But
well, I can't say I came up with it. I thought it was such an interesting piece of one of the reports of Hoveware, a payment facilitator. They had it was a table that they added to one of their reports, and they had kind of a 2021 Q3 breakdown of all of the crazy ransomware that was happening and why it was so prevalent. And there was this great graphic that says, look at the difference in the profit margin, how easy it is to get away with it, the arrest records. So one of the things that, first of all, it was hard to come up and be like telling a graphic designer, I want to make a graphic between the comparison of ransomware versus cocaine in the 90s. Like, that is a very weird ask to hear from one of your executives at a cyber company, that I need this graphic made and I need to compare cocaine to ransomware. But what was so interesting is, like, if you take it tongue in cheek, it shows you how profitable, like how profitable it is, that if this was such a big thing in the 90s where you had, this whole drug campaign against what was happening in the early 90s, then you have to see ransomware as a business and not sci-fi, like a business, a criminal function. Not only is it more profitable by this graphic, but it's also lower risk because of the arrest records. There's smaller barriers to entry, right? You don't have to be in a gang. You can be a 13-year-old in a basement with ransomware as a service. You have less arrests. Even though law enforcement has been making leaps and bounds, they're very segmented. They're focused. There's different locations of what CISA covers versus what what Secret Service covers in different areas, and so it's still disjointed. And they're trying their best to get in front of it. But they're continuing to evolve and move. And we've seen that with kind of the resurgence in a case that I'm working on with Black Cat or Alpha 5, something like that. They're known as two different names, and they are showing that they're continuing to evolve, where we've seen a lower amount of ransomware cases since the Ukraine and Russia war, but they're continuing to be sophisticated, doing things like going after the backups, corrupting backups, staying in a place longer, scanning it longer, doing their research longer before they make the move, and then utter destruction. And I think one of the other interesting things that reminds me of, the cocaine, the drug cartels that we're comparing it to is they're getting more confident, right? Like we used to see hackers brag about this on Twitter. And I used to think, if you say like, what is a tactic for threat actor harassment? I used to think Twitter was like the only way to brag about your incident. But since in this last year, I would say since 2021, I've seen things like them grabbing your email list, going after clients, saying, client XYZ, can you believe this firm would not pay for your information? Like super exploitive language that tarnishes reputation. And then the alternative, we've also seen what you call like sexploitations, where they'll make up a story that they have a video and they've seen pornographic images of you when you're taking a shower or something like that. And they're going to place that everywhere online. So they're trying like everything from the most absurd, gross tactics to just on Twitter and social media to even, we have now seen a public ransomware DDoS attack where they're actually posting the ransomware note for the public to see. That to me shows that they're getting more confident. I think that's not, is not traditional. And I think it correlates to what you're seeing in the graphic is this maybe a wake-up call to people that just like cocaine, just like the drug cartels didn't really discriminate from big to large, people in their pathway, then maybe this is also something that wakes up the smaller to medium-sized businesses that say, you know what, just because we're small doesn't mean we're going to get hit. It just means we might not have the resources to recover as fast as the big companies. And I feel like I wish that's like the end goal of this graphic is to say, you're not immune, but you can still try to protect yourself.
You may have never thought to compare drug cartels in the 1990s to today's ransomware attackers, but Coveware and Violet bring up an excellent point. These threat actors don't discriminate. They'll take down any size organization if it means they can profit by it. That doesn't mean you should be scared or paranoid. It just means that you need to be vigilant in protecting yourself.
Yeah, and I mean, again, we'll share the graphic, right? So I think it's a 98% profit margin, which implies a 5,000% return on investment, right? Which is a pretty high ROI. And then cocaine was 1,000, right? 91% profit margin, right? Which is 1,000% return on investment for those those finance geeks out there, right? Like those are very, very high numbers. There's almost nothing in the well, I don't know. Some tech businesses see similar type returns, but and money will flow in that way. But I guess until we as a society, and that's not just like happening in the US, right? Like, is there a willingness for sort of international collaboration, right? Because I think what's been really interesting about the internet was there was, this sort of, we're going to create this global community where, it's going to be this utopia of things where we can share knowledge and commerce across borders around the world in a way that we can't, and we have to some degree, right? There's the positive effects of that, but there's also the negative effects of that, and that, the realization that the rule of law is not the same in other countries, and the willingness for governments to allow their citizens to engage in activities that is not that is illegal and damaging to others, and to steal and to ransom and to destroy different businesses. And in fact, there's this really interesting co-opting of the co-opting of the criminal organizations and behavior for perhaps national security or sort of international competition among some of the largest states, right? That being, the US, China, Russia, Iran, blah, 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 name that, that willingness to essentially weaponize criminal activity in these types of conflicts and to use it to obscure. I mean, it's why it's sort of fascinating and interesting, but also, sad and I don't think it ever gets 100% solved, but is there more, collaboration across countries, across borders, to start to stop some of this activity? I don't know.
I think one of the barriers is actually that there's competing privacy and security sometimes. I think that where those are meant to fit together, where like privacy usually makes the rules and security surrounds the rules, and insurance ensures that there's like enough money behind that for the calamities. I think that privacy is being so highly debated right now with GDPR and, like all of Brazil, like all of these different groups coming out with like, okay, there's an inherent human right to privacy, that people are debating that and don't often come together on the security side. You know what I mean? Like we all value things differently, and Americans commoditize a lot of things, and then they don't want to share data because they don't want that data to be exploited. Like there's a lot of tension, I think, in how to collaborate or who's law enforcement's going to actually, I don't know. It's hard, and I'm trying to understand. I feel like that law enforcement angle is something that I'm trying to understand more of, because I had the criminal defense background. So my bias is like to be hesitant with law enforcement, but I'm trying to lean into it more in cyber because they are the ones encouraging collaboration, right? Law enforcement wants everyone to collaborate. The hard part is that sometimes not the most efficient way for businesses to respond is collaboration with law enforcement. But that's why you saw OFAC, come out with these ransomware requirements. The problem is attribution. Like, how do we even know who we're paying at the end of the day sometimes?
Yeah, totally. Well, Violet, this was really fun. Thank you so much for coming on. We'll put the graphic that we talked about in the notes here. We'll link to your profile and to and make sure to send us a few other ways that we can kind of link to some of the stuff that you're doing, and keep us posted on, I know you're working on a bunch of cases, so I would love to have you back at another time and walk through some of those other cases. And good stuff. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Cybercrime Lab, brought to you by DataStream Insurance. When the worst happens, you're going to want the best financial, legal, and technical support to get you back up and running again. With cyber insurance from DataStream, we find the most comprehensive insurance coverage on the market alongside critical post-incident customer support. Go to datastreaminsurance.com today and see how we can help you secure your business data. That's datastreaminsurance.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe and give us a 5-star review. You'll find show notes and any resources mentioned at cybercrimelabpodcast.com. We hope you'll join us next episode. Until then, stay safe. More importantly, stay ready.